was given to me or lent to me by Terry Dunning. And it is a school bell, right? Correct? An old school bell. It's well, I was saying yesterday, it's an old school bell. You know, old school, right? But it's an old school bell. Like, it's actually a school bell that people would use for school. So this is kind of creating a classroom environment. This isn't how we've done it in the past, but we've got kind of a classroom set up here. And you guys have that out today. So today we're going to start a new series.
I don't have a pen.
Yep, someone can have a pen, please. So today we're going to start our Christian Theology Introduction. And this is a bit of a test. This is different than we've done it before. And I'm a little nervous about doing it with the live stream because I'm hoping all of the technology will work. But we know how technology is. It fails you when you need it most, it seems like. So I'm going to be giving this presentation on Christian theology. And we're going to get as far as we can in the notes tonight. But after about 40 minutes or so, we'll have to wrap up. And sometimes I don't get through everything as quickly as I intend to. So we'll just go about 40 minutes here. All right, so this is introduction material. This is just to kind of get you oriented and kind of thinking about what we're going to talk about in Christian theology. And I thought it'd be good, you know, when we talk about Christian theology, sometimes there are controversies. And so I looked to a source recently, or found something from a source, just to kind of get us to think about maybe some controversies that we might face. And this has to do with atheism. And the source that I'm referring to is, we're already having technical difficulties. Yes, Babylon Bee. How many of you have heard of that? Okay. 2 people. All right. So Babylon Bee is a Christian satire website. I feel like I need to say that right off the bat, otherwise everybody's going to be really nervous and saying, what is he talking about? No, but this is just they do humorous stuff, so you need to laugh, okay? Please. But this is 10 arguments for Christianity that are guaranteed mic drops. Do you know what a mic drop is? That's where you say something that, case closed, you drop the mic, okay? So these are 10 arguments. Actually, I only picked several of them for time's sake and just because I picked my favorite ones. So not all 10, but this is the article. So the first one is, when you're arguing with an atheist, you say, you know who else makes that argument? Satan. Instantly invalidated, we're done. Number 2, hit him with a surprise, God's not dead flash mob. Now that takes some preparation, but with a loud boombox, some planning with friends, you can be ready to pull the ripcord at any moment during the debate and blindside your opponent with some Newsboys, that's the song from Newsboys, and dance choreography. So there's the God's not dead flash mob approach to controversy. There's a good one for us. Yeah, but we've still got Ravi Zacharias. So one thing to always remember when debating an atheist, no matter what point they're trying to score for their side, there's one obvious thing that an atheist is sorely lacking that a Christian is not. Ravi Zacharias. Now, if you know who Ravi Zacharias is a great, amazing mind, and he's on our side. All right? So here's another one. Repeatedly shout, "Get thee behind me, Satan," while assuming Gandalf's classic, "You shall not pass pose." And this argument has numerous benefits. First, you're letting any onlookers know that your opponent is literally Satan, which invalidates all of their arguments. Also, if you do this over and over, eventually your opponent will just leave. Fly, you fools! That's a reference to Lord of the Rings. Not everybody may know that. All right. So if anybody's just starting to listen in on this, we're reading from a Babylon Bee satire article. I'm not taking this seriously. But you can settle arguments as a Christian talking to an atheist with a Chick-fil-A versus any atheist chicken sandwich franchise blind taste test. as Christians, there is one truth that we can hold on to that nobody can take away. Chick-fil-A. This franchise makes the greatest chicken sandwich on the planet, and it is ours. Anyone who prefers atheism to Christianity needs to go try an atheist chicken sandwich. We'll wait. All right. These are mic drops, aren't they? Like, you definitely win the arguments with you. All right. Ask, who do people call upon when they unexpectedly sneeze? All right, so that's another thing you can do, right? Wait out brief silence and then say, case closed. Imagine a world where you sneeze and nobody says anything to you. This is the kind of godless hellscape atheists want to bring about. Point this out and watch their head explode. We're done here. And I think this is the last one I have. Repeatedly bring everything back to the Kalam cosmological argument until your opponent is exhausted, and then hit them with the second law of thermodynamics. So once you've worn your opponent down by going over and over the impossibility of an actual infinite, and they're lying on the floor twitching, then bring out the entropy argument. Look at your broken down opponent and say, entropy, boy. Mic drop. Now, the reason I read that is because I thought that was quite humorous. But it also does make a point as we start studying theology, and it makes it in a humorous way, that sometimes our arguments as Christians really aren't the strongest, right? Sometimes we don't make very good arguments. We have to be honest with that. Sometimes when we're trying to express our faith, we don't do a good job communicating. Now, hopefully you're not doing anything quite that extreme, but still, we have to really think, how am I communicating? And the other thing is, some of those arguments, or the way that they're portrayed, and it's satire, but it's condescending, right? We can be very condescending. And so we have to be careful of that too. As we study Christian theology, one of the goals, I hope, is that we actually gain a sense of humility. Like, we realize that there's so much we don't know. And the subjects that we're covering are just incredible. So it should give us a sense of humility rather than coming across as know-it-alls. Not that we would ever do that, right? We would never come across as know-it-alls. But it can happen. We really need to think about that. So tonight, I'm going to cover as much as I can here, but we're going to look at what is Christian theology. We're going to define it. Why do Christians need theology? Why do non-Christians need theology? And where are we going to be going in this series? Because this is just the beginning. And we're going to look at where we're going. So by way of introduction, we're going to try to answer these questions here as clearly as we can. And so we're going to start with the definition of Christian theology. And I hope to make the case for why Christians and non-Christians need it. And then we'll look at where we're going. All right. So what is Christian theology? I have a definition here. And actually, before I show you that, I went ahead a little bit. I actually meant to show you this word over here. And you have it in your notes, but you want to fill in that blank, I'm sure. I know everybody wants to make sure they fill in all the blanks. So I mentioned this before to those who were here early. This is not misspelled. It looks like it is. But the word theology is actually from a Greek word. And the Greek word is theologia. Theologia. And if you break it down, some of you can do this. Do you have any idea what this first part means? God. I heard God. Very good. So that means God. All right. And then the second part here, any idea what that means? A lot of times when you were in school, you've heard ology as the study of. What it literally means, though, is word. Okay? So it is a word about God. That is the actual definition in a literal sense of what the word means. And that's where we get the word theology. Theology is the English version of this, but it's a Greek word. So that's where we get the idea. It's a word about God. It's talking about God. And I'll read a couple other things here that I think are pretty interesting. The Greek verb theologeo refers to the act of speaking about a god, while the noun theologos refers to a person who engages in theologeo. Now, that was a little bit of Greek there, so that can sound confusing. But this is the point here. The earliest known Christian use of one of these terms is actually in reference to the Apostle John in the 2nd century. Early in the 2nd century, he was called a theologos, or a theologian. So early Christians looked at the Apostle John as a theologian. So that's just a little history of the term. Now, the next thing I wanted to show you was that definition given by Millard Erickson, who has a great systematic theology book. And he says that Christian theology is a discipline of study that seeks to understand the God revealed in the Bible and to provide a Christian understanding of reality. I want you to notice here that because we're defining Christian theology, he brings out that we're going to get a Christian understanding of reality. That's one of the goals. We want to understand how do you look at the world as a Christian. But also notice it is a discipline of study. And some of you caught on to that. When we're talking about ologies, we're talking about studying. And so we're going to be studying. We're actually going to be doing some examining and looking at information and thinking about it on a deeper level. And that's what it is. It's a discipline of study. And it seeks to understand the God revealed in the Bible and to provide a Christian understanding of reality. Now, this is something I think is important, that theology, like science, should actually be a process of inquiry and discovery, helping us to explore infinitely grandiose realities that we will never fully understand. So I want to bring it back again to this idea that we should be humbled. We should really be overwhelmed when we're learning things like this, just like science. Have you ever been studying science and just been amazed by what you've learned? I mean, I watch these scientific videos. I love to watch science videos. And I'll be watching them, and the first thing that happens is I'll watch the science video, and I'll be like, wow, that is awesome. I learned so much. And then, you know, the next thing I feel? Wow, there's a lot I don't know. It really should, this should happen when you study theology. If you study theology and you go, wow, I know everything. There's something wrong with your approach, right? Science has a way of humbling us when we realize we discover. However, I do want to point out that just like science, it does help you to understand things more accurately and fully than before. And so as you study theology, it actually helps you to understand things more accurately than you did before, and to understand them on a deeper level. But you're still not going to understand everything. Okay? So, I wanted to point that out. And then the next thing in your notes here, Christian theology, I'm defining as the study of God and of spiritual matters from a biblical perspective in light of the time and place in which we live. So notice, again, I'm bringing out, just like Millard Erickson did, that we're going to study this from the Bible, from a biblical perspective. We will use the Bible. And the Bible really is tied in with Christianity. It contains the Old and the New Testaments, and it culminates, as we read the Bible, in the person of Jesus Christ. And so as Christians, we dearly regard the Bible, don't we? And we want to study it. We want to know what it says. We want to understand it better. And it's our source documents as Christians. It really shows us the whole history of where everything started and how God did things and where we come from, right? As God's people, too. It tells our history. And so we're going to look at the Bible as we study in order to really get a grasp of theology. And that's very important when we talk about Christian theology, is understanding it is a biblical study. So now, let's get into that second question. Why do Christians need theology? Why do Christians need theology? And so the first thing in your notes here is that Christians need theology for spiritual health and worship. Christians need theology for spiritual health and worship. So I want to show you, first of all, that in your Christian life, it's very important. I happened to be reading recently where a pastor was just talking about how we need to be more focused, and we kind of heard today how we need a balance. We heard this morning at church. We need a balance of hearing and doing. But this pastor was emphasizing the doing. But if we're going to be spiritually healthy, we do actually need to hear and understand things about God. Right? We need to understand things in order to be nourished in our lives, in order to be strengthened in our lives, and so that we'll be spiritually healthy and we'll worship God in spirit and in truth. Now, I'd like to point out a particular passage here from Matthew chapter 22, and I'll get back to that point there. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they came together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked a question to test Jesus. "Teacher, which command in the law is the greatest?" And he said to him, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands." So this is an expert in the law who's studying essentially the Bible, and he's saying to Jesus, I've studied. What do you think is the greatest command? What do you think is most important? And Jesus says it's to love God with everything, your heart, your soul, your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so, the great commandment is, that's what Jesus was giving there, the great commandment. It is the greatest basis for a Christian to study theology. If the most important thing for a Christian is to love God and love others, that needs to be the motivation, right? And so let me say this. If studying theology doesn't help you love God and other people better, then you're not approaching it the right way. And I'm not approaching it the right way. If it causes you to somehow actually just put God out there more and think of him as distant and you don't really know him better and love him more, or if it somehow pushes people away from you, you don't, instead of identifying with them better and loving them the way God wants you to, you actually start to look down on people who don't have as much knowledge as you, then you're totally missing the point. And by the way, that's why people criticize theology, because they've seen that happen, right? The people who know all this stuff, but they're not doing what Jesus said. So, theology is important. I really do believe it's important for Christians. However, it only fulfills its purpose if it's helping us to love God and love others more. By the way, the reason I emphasize theology in terms of loving God, and Jesus talks about how important that is you've seen this in your own life. Who do you love the most, and who do you trust the most? It's people that you've grown close to, and you know them the most. So knowing God is very important. Knowing about him is very important in order to love him, in order to trust him more in our lives, right? So think about the people you know. They've revealed things to you. They've told you things about themselves, and it's brought you closer to them. And that's the idea here, that God tells us things. We can learn about him, and it can help us to know him and trust him. Now that's for a Christian. A Christian has that goal in mind, to look at theology so that I can know him, so that I can love him, and so that I can love others the way that he calls me to. Another reason Christians need to know theology is because we're living in a culture that is increasingly different than the Christian worldview. It is a culture that today is largely naturalistic, materialistic, and humanistic in its perspective. So those are pretty big terms, and you're probably going to have to take a little time to write those down. So the first one there is naturalistic. Now this probably can be defined different ways, but I want to just point out that that term, naturalistic, obviously is based on the word nature. And the idea here is that in our culture, you hear this all the time, right? Nature. You've heard that word a little bit? It's used all the time. And nature is actually considered the explanation for everything. Why is everything here? Because everything's here. That's almost like the explanation, right? It's like nature just explains itself. Now I'm talking about how the culture in general tends to talk about things. So it's like, how did we even get here? Natural processes, right? And that leads to the second thing, materialistic. I'm not talking about like being greedy or something. I'm talking about the word material as opposed to spiritual. What makes us us? And everything tends to be explained in material terms. Well, you're made of molecules, and you have these this brain with electric impulses taking place, and so everything's explained in terms of material things rather than spiritual. There's some talk of spiritual in our culture, but by and large, this is how we explain everything. And then finally, humanistic. Anybody have a guess as to what that means? Anybody have a guess? I know, I'm just putting you on the spot here, but what do you think it kind of means when we talk about someone having a humanistic perspective?
Man-centered?
Yeah. The answer there, man-centered, that's a good way to look at it. Anything else?
Without God.
Okay. Yep, without God. You do see actually in our culture a growing atheism. And I was joking earlier about how we argue with atheists. But there is a growing atheism, isn't there? There really is. There's more and more people that are either atheists, they really believe there's no God, or they have a lot of doubts. They have a lot of doubts. And so that is all wrapped up in this. It has to do with us being kind of not only the center of everything, but how do we even get knowledge? We get knowledge from ourselves. How do you find all knowledge that's possible? We kind of look at it as, well, it's us, right? So it's like this idea that we discover everything there is to know on our own is kind of the idea there. You kind of see that a lot today. And yeah, humans are kind of the center of everything at the end of the day. So man-centered is definitely a good description. So that's very different than Christianity, isn't it? Very different. The worldview of Christianity is increasingly different from the general worldview of American culture. I'm sure you've observed this and seen this, but as a Christian in America, you've observed the changes, and that Christianity at one time was a very predominant view, and now you know more and more people that don't hold to Christianity, or they're not very clear about it. And the reality is the West is changing, isn't it? The whole Western world is changing. It was so rooted in Judeo-Christian viewpoints, and yet today that's really subsiding. That trend is changing. So Christianity is more and more getting juxtaposed, coming into contradiction with what we're seeing around us. And it's being challenged more and more. Now, this is nothing new. This is nothing. Christianity being challenged, even in the Bible, early Christianity, you had a missionary like Paul. And he's going to places. And when Paul went to places to talk about Christianity, everybody just gave him a big hug, right? They're just like, yes, a Christian! We love him! No, as one of the early Christians, he was encountering opposing worldviews. And the two worldviews that were really big, that he even talks about, are the Jewish worldview, which is what he was from, and the other one is the Greek worldview. The Greek worldview. And so when Paul would go to to Jews, he would talk about Christianity, and they had a certain worldview. And then when he talked to Greeks, they had a certain worldview, and he had to think about who he was talking to as he explained his faith in Jesus Christ. Now, as he was talking in Athens, Greece, he actually had the opportunity to go and talk to philosophers there in this city. And in Acts 17, he gives his speech there about Christianity. And Jerome Bars, a writer, Christian writer, says, "It is immediately obvious, when Paul's talking in Athens, that there are no quotations from the Old Testament. Whereas Paul's synagogue sermons, for example, the one given in Pisidian Antioch, in the synagogue, his sermon was full of Old Testament quotations and allusions. So, when he's talking to Jewish people, they know the Scripture, and he makes sure that that's where he starts. He's going to bring out the Scriptures. He says, Jerome Bars says, his hearers in Athens were completely unfamiliar with the Old Testament, so no purpose would have been served by assuming knowledge of it and quoting from it except to confuse them. Instead, Paul quoted from two of the Athenians' own thinkers. Very interesting. So Paul, of course, he gives biblical truth. He's going to explain Christianity. But when he's talking to the Greeks, one of the things he does is actually quote their own scholars. Okay? Because he's trying to explain things in a way that they will understand. But ultimately, he's trying to give a very clear message about Christianity. There's no doubt about that. But he's trying to make sure that he explains things that will really help to intersect the Christian perspective with their worldview. Well, here's what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 22 and 23 about those two groups I just talked about. He says, the Jews asked for signs. So the Jewish people always wanted to see these miracles. How is God working? What did the Greeks care about? Wisdom. Greek wisdom, right? Great philosophy. Great knowledge. We know so much. We have great scholars. And what does Paul say about this? He says, well, we're talking to these people, but we're preaching Jesus crucified on a cross. And does everybody accept it? No, it's a stumbling block, he says to the Jews, right? They're looking for some Messiah with these great signs. Of course, Jesus, we'll talk about that, did some amazing things. But it's still, Jesus being on the cross, that's a stumbling block to the Jews. He was killed. He was executed. And to the Gentiles, the Greeks, foolishness. I mean, we have great teaching. What is this you're talking about, a man on a cross? So the Christian worldview has always brought opposition. It's always had opposing viewpoints as Christians have tried to be a witness and share their perspective. So that's happening today, right? As you're a Christian today, if you're a Christian, you notice that there's a viewpoint out there that's probably very different from what you believe as a Christian. And so secularism, or secular humanism, is the opposing worldview in our culture. Secular humanism. So there's that word humanism again. But I'd like to demonstrate just the perspective differences from what the Bible talks about and what people in the past, how they conveyed things, and then what we tend to see in our culture, secularism. So how do people today think about the weather? Well, of course, we complain about it a lot up here in New England, right? But hey, we don't have this to complain about, all right? We're not dealing with hurricanes. However, when you think about the weather, of course, we know with what the Bible talks about, that it talks about God controlling the weather. And even there were ancient people who had ideas about, well, maybe it's this particular God that we believe in that controls the weather. But the idea is that they thought the weather was related to God, right? When we think about the weather today in our culture, though, we tend to think about satellite images. And that we can kind of predict it, right? We try to predict it. But we do think differently about the weather, right, in this culture than what you see in the Bible. Another example is, this is a wonderful picture here, something we all know and love. Disease. I think I read that's actually tuberculosis. Some of you knew that by just looking at it, I guess. I don't know. But when people in the past thought about disease, they might immediately think about the connection with the spiritual, right? Oh, disease, there's something spiritual about this, whereas we automatically go to the physical. Again, the material aspect of things. And there's certainly truth in this. So we have to think about this. How does Christianity talk about these things with the knowledge that we have today? And then one more that I'll give you here. Anybody guess what that's referring to? Okay, evolution. And as you look at that drawing, it's a very common image in our culture. And that gets back to what I talked about earlier, this natural explanation for everything. That we can just explain everything by nature. Now, how did the Bible writers talk about our origins? How did the thinkers of the past talk about where we came from? There was this idea that there had to be a creator, a designer. All right? There had to be some intelligence and power that created us. Today, we tend to shy away in our culture from that idea. And it's just, this is it, right? We just got here, and we don't have full explanations. By the way, scientists will say, if they're not Christians, if they're secular scientists, they will say, we really don't actually know for sure where life came from. Okay? But this is kind of the explanation they're going with, right? That this somehow evolution explains it all. Now, that is something we really need to think about as Christians. It is part of our culture, and it is part of what mainstream science is telling us. So we have to think about these things. So here's a really important point. We, as Christians, number one, we need theology for our spiritual health and worship of God, and know Him and love Him, but we also need it because we live in a world that doesn't think the way Christians do. And so, theology, I skipped, actually. It's in the notes here, though. Theology should be an interaction of our study of God with the world that we presently live in. I don't know where the slide went, but I want you to write that in your notes. Theology should be an interaction of our study of God with the world that we presently live in. Good theology has always done it. Why was John, I mentioned that earlier, the Apostle John, known as a theologian? Because he was interacting with the people of his day. And that's what we have to do. We can't just hide, right, as Christians and say, okay, we'll just believe our own thing and we won't talk to anybody. We actually have to interact with the world around us. Plus, let's face it, the people around us and the things that are happening in our culture, we're going to hear them. And it's going to cause questions to come to our mind, right? It's happened a lot, I'm sure. You're like, oh, wow, I was listening to something the other day, and it really made me ask this question as a Christian. So we have to interact what we know as Christians with what is being told to us and what we're hearing in our culture. All right, but that leads to this summary. That theology, then, for Christians is for our edification, to build us up, to strengthen us in our faith, and to help us as a witness. In other words, as we try to talk to people, rather than being, that article I showed at the beginning, that's supposed to be humorous, right? We don't want to just be, just totally out of touch. We need to have a good witness, a faithful witness. By the way, you can read in the Bible and see, again, someone like Paul. He knew how to share what he believed in a clear way, in a way that was able to converse with the cultures of his day. All right, so it's definitely good for Christians. You probably knew that, but I really wanted to show you the importance. But also non-Christians. Non-Christians can learn from theology. How? Well, one thing I want to point out here is that you may not realize it, but everybody has theology. Everybody has a theology. In other words, everybody believes something about God, even if they think He's not there. You have some sort of a concept or view about God and about spiritual matters. So one thing that listening to Christian theology will do is it will actually help you to examine your own worldview, even if you're not a Christian, right? I play the piano. A lot of people know that. And some people say, wow, you're good at the piano. And if I didn't really, pay attention to other pianists out there, I could just take everybody's word. Wow, I am so good. But I have to come into contact with a reality that there are some pianists out there that, when I look at myself compared to them, I'm not very good. Right? I'm not very good. And so what happens is we get our own viewpoint of things, and if all we have as a reference is ourselves, it's skewed. But when you actually compare yourself with others, it broadens your perspective. So you have a worldview, whatever it is, when you start studying theology, you start to go, maybe I need to learn more. Maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. Okay? But that leads to a second thing. And that is, it helps actually for people to understand Christians. In America today, Christians make up a significant portion of the population still. And I think it's important, even if people aren't Christians, that they actually take the time to truly understand what Christians think. So it'll help you understand Christians because we're a big part of this country here, but also when you think about Christianity's influence in the West. We live, of course, in the West, and a lot of people don't realize this. They just think, we're here and we're doing all these things because we just decided to. No, Christianity played a big part in why we do what we do here. And a lot of people don't realize that. So it really helps you to understand Christians and the role that they play in the past and in the present. And then, I would love for this to be the case, for people to consider if Christianity is true. And maybe it would offer something that this stuff can't. I really believe this, that a lot of people, they mean well, and they're searching, but they're just living their lives, and they're listening to all kinds of things that are out there in our culture. And you could probably answer this question for yourself. Does what's out there, by and large in our culture, really give us hope? I mean, is that really the mood of our culture? We just have great sense of hope about things. I mean, of course, we want to build a better world. But really, the world has problems. And it's hard to understand that sometimes. Even if we're trying, and then tragedy happens. And we go, well, what's going on? So the world doesn't offer us much hope in terms of what's the purpose for even being here? And where are we ultimately headed? The culture around us doesn't offer us much clear hope. So maybe there's something in Christianity. I know that I can say so many people have found Jesus and who he is and what is given in Christianity to give them great hope. And I would want for people to discover or to search for that and to see if Christianity is offering something that they don't have. So I want to just conclude. I don't have this on a slide, but I want to conclude, and then I'm going to tell you about upcoming topics. So I want to conclude. For Christians, I want to encourage you, and I know everybody here goes to a great church. Because we go to Calvary Baptist Church here in Claremont, New Hampshire. But definitely, we need to be studying God's Word. We need to be reading the Bible. Here's what I want to say about Christian theology. Don't get bits and pieces. Actually read. Read books of the Bible, right? Read books of the Bible because it will really help you to understand things in their context and in a clear way. And if you're a Christian out there and you don't have a church, try to make sure you're getting good biblical teaching. Go to a church that teaches the Bible. I actually had a pastor tell me recently they started teaching the Bible at a church that they had started pastoring. And someone came up to them after a few weeks, because they were new there, and they said, why do you always teach from the Bible? Okay? So there are people out there in churches that are not hearing the Bible. Okay? But study it. Again, the source documents of Christianity. But for non-believers, I just would conclude by saying listen and seek, because our culture is in disarray. And I'm going to talk about that more, about just kind of the disintegration of where the West is right now, and postmodernism. And I'm going to talk more about our worldview. This was just an introduction, but I would encourage non-believers just to listen, okay? Just listen and think and seek for discovery, because Christianity has a lot to say that is worth listening to. Now, what exactly are we going to talk about? If you thought that what we did tonight was okay, just wait. Because we're going to talk about worldview, what do people believe in and why. We're going to talk about the Bible. What is the Bible? Why should we study and believe it? I mean, I just said that tonight, but there could be people out there going, yeah, but why? Why should I listen to the Bible? We'll talk about that. God. Is there a God? What is he actually like? What is God like? Humans. How did we get here? Why are we here? What is our problem? Right? Salvation. This is a term used in Christianity, but what does Christianity teach about salvation? And here's an important point for everybody. What's going to happen in the future? What's going to happen to me? Right? So our destiny. Is there an afterlife? These kinds of questions. The church. That's a simple topic, right? Why are there so many kinds of churches? And what is the church supposed to be anyway? Well, look at that. The spirit world. Are Satan and demonic forces real? What about angelic beings? And if so, what are they like? These are pretty interesting topics, right? And then finally, this is a topic everybody loves. I like this topic, but I am amazed how many people love this topic. How's the world going to end? All right, so we'll look at that too. We're going to, like I said, the definition right at the beginning, it's giving a Christian perspective of reality, including even how everything ends. And we're going to look at all that. So that's the introduction, and I'm just going to close this time in prayer. Father, I thank you so much that we've had this wonderful opportunity just to begin to talk about the importance of theology. And Lord, my prayer, my deep prayer, is that you will use this. I know, Lord, that we're all limited in our understanding. And so my prayer, God, is that you would give us greater understanding, and that you would use even the little that I'm doing here to try to teach to help people to begin to search for you, and to search for truth, and to search for answers. And I pray, Lord, that there would just be a sense of the hope that we can have when we begin to look at what the Bible talks about and what Jesus said and who he is. I pray, Lord, that people would come to find answers and find peace, and that you would guide them into understanding who Jesus is and what Christianity teaches. So thank you for this time, Lord. Thank you for this church and for the opportunity we have to be together. And I pray that you'll bless the rest of this evening. I ask in Jesus' name. Amen.